We are studying the books of Ezra, Esther, and then back to Ezra. And this week we finished the first 6 chapters of Ezra, so tonight we get to start Esther. Because time-wise, Esther fits exactly at this point in the book of Ezra. A lot of the books of the Bible have overlapping parts to them, and this is one of them. We would also suggest that Nehemiah is one that should be also studied in connection with Ezra and Esther. But tonight we're in Esther chapter 1, and we're looking at verse 1. And so if you turn your Bibles there, then we'll begin looking at it. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. And then notice we're given some information about these different kings through excavations, and given some information about this particular king right here. This Ahasuerus was also known as Xerxes II in our history books. And he reigned from 486 to 465 BC. He was the oldest son of another famous king that's well known in history and also to us as Bible students, Darius the First. Darius was known as Hystaspes, and this is not the same Ahasuerus that we saw in Ezra 4 and verse 6. This is a different Ahasuerus that we're looking at now. We also are shown in this text the king's territory. He ruled, notice this, we rule from India to Ethiopia. That's a big amount of land. If you picture in your mind the concept of all of this, India is an old Persian word in this context that means Hindu. And the Sanskrit meaning of the word is Great River. So in other words, if you can picture in your mind where the Indus River was, all the way east, or west rather, through all of that land, he ruled all of that land, even to parts of the Grecian territory. And so this was a huge empire, stretching all the way from, again, a portion of Greece to the Indus River and south to Ethiopia. And you remember that on the way to Ethiopia, you go through Egypt. And so he was ruling a lot of this. And it was divided into 127 provinces. We think we have a lot of states, 50 states. Imagine 127 states, because that's basically the idea behind the idea of provinces. In verses 2 through 4, he says that in those days when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces being before him. And when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty, many days, even 180 days. Now, notice that Ahasuerus is pictured as sitting on his throne. There's something interesting about that. The Persian kings seem to always be pictured in the scriptures as sitting on their thrones, even when they were traveling, even in battle. Now, this is a lot different than, say, the Greeks or some of the other kingdoms where the king was probably usually on a horse or something of that nature, but the Persian kings are always pictured as sitting on a throne, even when they were traveling and even in battle. So these thrones were also always elevated, so that anybody who came before the king had to look up at the king. That is, honoring his position. They had to. There's no other way they could look at the king. They had to look up at him. The place of this extravagant and really outlandish feast is given to us. It's called the Palace of Shushan. This was also known by another name to Bible students as Susa. And so there were 3 other capitals also in the empire. Isn't that interesting? They had 4 capitals, and during a year's time, the king would live in all 4 of those capitals from time to time. Persepolis and Akabanta and Babylon. Babylon. It's interesting, isn't it? Especially when you study the book of Daniel. These capitals were occupied by the king according to the time of year. Some of them were summer palaces. Some of them were winter palaces. It's kind of like folks today in the United States that, certain months of the year, they travel from up in the cold areas of Michigan and New York and all those places, and they travel to where? Florida. And sometimes it was just based on the whim, but usually it was based on the time of the year that it was which one of these capitals the king would be in. The particular date of this feast is not specified to us, except in this point. It was during the 3rd year of Ahasuerus' reign, but we don't know what part of that 3rd year of his reign that it was in. And this is going to make the time frame about 483 BC. Now, I hope you all notice I don't use the modern terms of BCE or ADE, because those terms are meant to take away the idea that our calendar indeed is based on the birth of Jesus. And AD and BC designate that. The people of our world today are trying as hard as they can to get away from any kind of imagery of religion. And so they want to call it BCE and ADE or whatever it was. I forget what the AD part was. But this was what we asked the question then, what was the purpose of this feast? Notice that it was done before all of his nobles, all of these high-ranking people, and also among the people. But it was done to show the power and the riches of Persia. This particular Ahasuerus was extremely rich. And he's bragging, in other words. He's letting them know, hey, look how rich I am. I'm going to hold a feast for my nobles and my princes of all the provinces. The power of Persia and Media. Notice this probably refers, the power of the Persia and Media probably refers to military leaders. And so how long did this feast last? A half a year. Think about that. He puts on this great feast for half a year. Now, we don't know if he had all of his high-ranking people come to this feast and be there for the whole half a year. It may have been done in parts. We don't know. We don't have any indication of how that was done. But imagine throwing a feast which was designed to show all of his might and his power. Imagine the amount of food and the alcoholic beverages that were flowing, because the word wine in this particular context absolutely refers to that. It's not known how it was done, whether in stages or bring back part of them so the empire would be protected, or whether it was left under. So the power was so great that people just didn't dare rebel against him. We don't know. But time-wise, this feast appears to have been held shortly after Ahasuerus defeated Egypt. So this would have been if indeed it is in that period of time, which most of the scholars think it was, then it would probably have been a celebration of the great power that was his in defeating the great Egyptian empire. It may also have coincided with his plans to conquer Greece, and may have been a time when he was laying plans to do this. This Ahasuerus is going to try to conquer Greece, and he's going to fail miserably. As we look in the text, we see that the feast, though, did not end at 180 days. Another 7 days was then added to it. Well, what were those 7 days? Why did he add those 7 days to it? Again, he's still showing off the great riches that he has, the riches of the empire, and the pride. He's showing his pride in all of this. And you know, that's a dangerous thing when pride gets a hold of a person. It's something that will cause all kinds of problems. We know this from the book of Proverbs, especially. In chapter 11 and verse 2, the Bible tells us when pride cometh, what? Cometh upon a person or a people, a nation. It can be a whole nation. They get so proud that, you know, you can't defeat us. That's what America thinks right now. All we got to do is point to some of these ancient empires that were so powerful and how quickly they fell. And even in our modern times, our so-called modern times, look how fast the empire of the Soviet Union fell. It is no more. When pride cometh, then cometh what? Shame. I can't help, I got to go back to Daniel. What happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he let his pride take over him? He was shamed by being given the mind of an animal and had to go out and eat grass with the cows. and the dew fell on him, didn't have enough sense to go in out of the rain. In the mouth of the foolish is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise shall preserve. Proverbs 14:3. What's a rod? A rod is unbending, right? A prideful person gets to a point where they can't bend. They can't listen to advice that is given to them that is good and cause them to change their ways. Again, look at Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel tried to get him, didn't he? In chapter 4, didn't Daniel try to get him to amend his ways so that this thing that was going to come upon him, the mind of an animal, would be changed? And look at Proverbs 16 and verse 18. We're all familiar with this one. What? Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Again, emphasized by the man Daniel and Ahasuerus and all of these others throughout all time, in individuals, in companies. Companies sometimes can get a leader, whatever he is called, that he becomes so arrogant that he thinks he can just do whatever he wants to. Well, that's Ahasuerus here. Look at verses 5 through 8. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan, the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. This is talking about those 7 days that were added to the 180 days of feasting. Where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. And they gave them drink in the vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel. For so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. A feast. Mishteh is the Hebrew word here. It means drink, and by implication, the act of drinking. This was a drinking fest, this 7-day feast. This feast is not so much about food and drink. This feast is about drinking. The context shows that it was simply an excuse for these people to drink to excess, not just to drink a little of the king's wine, but to drink into excess. And remember, this feast began after the half-year feast, the 180-day feast. So think about the quantity of wine that the king had that he's been putting out. Where was this feast held? It says the text says the court of the garden of the king's palace. Probably because he had nowhere inside the feast or inside the palace to hold that kind of a feast. Now, we know that, for instance, the Assyrians, in the excavations that have been done for Nineveh, we know that they had at least one hall that was about 157 feet long, or I believe it's about 157 or 150 feet by about 57 feet deep. And that's a pretty good size building. I don't know how that compares to this building. I didn't measure it out, but whatever it is, that's a pretty good size building. A lot of people could be in there. But notice it's for the people of the palace primarily. Now, when we think about the people of the palace, we need to understand that there have been certain nobles that lived in this palace as well as the hired servants, from the greatest to the lowest, it says. And notice the extravagant decorations there. And it talks about beds of gold and silver. What's that talking about? Why did he have beds for the people because they ate a little differently than we do. You know, we have a table, don't we? And we pull chairs up to that table and we sit down, put the plate on the table, and that's how we eat. That's not how they ate. They ate reclined. Same way that Jesus did in the New Testament. When John, remember, has talked about leaning on the breast of Jesus at the last Passover feast that was ever officially held, they were reclined. And so that's the way they did it in those times. So what it's probably talking about is the cloth that was on these pillows and things that they used to recline on to be drinking their wine, being interwoven with silver and gold thread. I've got a banner that was given to me by the students in Indonesia that's what it was done. I mean, there are all kinds of colors of cloth in it and thread, but also woven in among those are threads of gold. And so that's probably the emphasis here on this. They were provided cups of gold in which to drink. And notice something. Did you notice something about those cups? It specifies they were vessels being diverse one from another. What's that talking about? These weren't just, in our homes many times, we may have a set of glasses that's set in a pantry of some kind, what do we call those things? The pantries, china cabinets, thank you. Those china cabinets, and they're all identical. That isn't what this is talking about. This is saying they were all different. Think about that, a number of different gold vessels he would have had to have. And again, he's showing off, he's bragging about all of his riches. Why, I'm so rich, look at all of these vessels that I have, and they're all different from one another. Note that no one also was forced to drink. They had a law, apparently, that no one could force someone to drink the king's beverages, that is, the alcohol, couldn't be forced to do it. It's kind of interesting to me. Note also that the guests were allowed to drink all that they wanted. The text says they should do according to every man's pleasures. However many drinks the person wanted. His servants, who would be waiting on them, had to give it to them. Whatever they wanted, give it to them. Consider again that this was a drinking party. And when we realize that it was a drinking party, does it help us to understand, would we wonder why a rash decision was going to be made at this feast? And there's going to be a very rash decision made. Look at verse 9 of the text. Also, Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. The queen. What's her name? Vashti. It's actually pronounced Vashti, but we've grown up knowing or calling her Vashti. Vashti the queen, Vashti the queen. Her name means beautiful or excellent woman. The excellent woman would have referred to her qualities, her character. Brown Driver and Brown in their lexicon just simply used the word she was beautiful. You know, beauty is something that is different in every society. Some societies think it's something really beautiful to stick a bone through the nose of a person. You know, others think that it's a mark of beauty to cover from their waist all the way up to their neck in tattoos. Beauty is different depending on society that we live in. You wonder how Vashti was so beautiful. You know, I doubt any of you would say that Jenny's beautiful, but to me, she's the most beautiful woman in the world. And that's the way it should be among husbands and wives, isn't it? Yeah. She should be the most beautiful woman to any husband, his wife. We don't know what her beauty entailed. The assumption has often been that she had this feast for the women in the palace of Ahasuerus, separate from the men because the women weren't allowed to be in the same place while a feast was going on. Weren't allowed to do that. That's been an assumption. I don't believe that's what's talked about here. Because when you look at Esther chapter 3 or chapter 5 and verses 3 through 6 or chapter 7 verses 1 and 2, what do you see? A woman in the presence of men during a feast. Esther is going to be in the presence of Haman and King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes as we know him, in both of those places. But remember, we also noticed that a woman could be in those feasts as long as they were invited by the king. In the case of Esther in chapter 5 and chapter 7, she was asked for permission to have a feast, and the king said, yes, that's an invitation. They could attend mixed feast as long as the king invited them. But if they were not invited, then they could not come into the presence of the king. In fact, no one could come into the presence of the king unless they were invited, except for one special group of men that we're going to notice later, 7 in number, and we'll notice them a little later. They had access to the king at any time except when he was with one of his wives. Her guests were probably the wives of the men, I say probably, the wives of the men who had been invited to the king's feast. Look at verses 10 through 12. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Bagtha, and Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. But the queen, Vashti, refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Oh, we got a problem here. The king has given a command. Dangerous thing to not do what the king asked to do. I remember looking at something that was written in the what we call the Chronicles of the Kings of Persia, where Ahasuerus, this same Ahasuerus, had a man split in half, and the 2 halves of the man were put across from each other and marched his whole army between those halves. Why? Because he had commissioned or he had made a commandment that all the people, all the men who were a certain age had to be in the army. And there was one man who wrote to the king or beseeched the king, I don't know if he wrote to him or in his presence asked, that his one son could be exempted from that to help him at home while his other 7 sons were serving in the army. And Ahasuerus, look how mean and cruel this man was. Ahasuerus divided that son in half and made the entire army march between the halves. It was dangerous to say no to a king. Now notice when this happened. The 7th day of this feast. Xerxes is well on his way to being drunk out of his mind, as we would say today. I've heard some people use the term drunk out of his skull. Mind. The word wine here is an interesting word. It is the word yakin. It means to effervesce. Thus, it came to mean wine that's fermented. Now think about that. By implication, intoxication. Strong's lexicon. Well, what does the word effervesce mean? It's a word that's used of a liquid that gives off bubbles. Remember the primary word that was, or the primary definition that was given by Strong for this word that we translate wine here? To effervesce. Now someone says, well, no, wait a minute. Liquid that gives off bubbles? Why, hey, I drink Coca-Cola all the time and it gives off bubbles. Is that what he's talking about? Remember, they didn't have Coca-Cola. You couldn't order Coca-Cola at his feast. What gives off bubbles? Alcoholic wine. Now let's remember something. The word wine is often used in the scriptures to connotate anything from the grape that's still on the vine, or the grape that's just been freshly plucked, or the grape that's been mashed into juice and is fresh and is non-alcoholic, but it can also be used to refer to alcohol. That's why people sit back and say, oh yeah, see, we can drink alcohol. Didn't Jesus make wine? He didn't make alcoholic wine, because he would have been sinning according to the Old Testament law, and he never sinned. Effervescence. Liquid that bubbles. Alcoholic beverage, in other words. Ahasuerus, in his intoxicated state, ordered his 7 chamberlains, these 7 men that we have the names of, to bring Queen Vashti to him at this feast. The word chamberlains comes from a word that means saris, or rather the word sarisi. And what that word means is castrate, a eunuch, in other words. Now that word can sometimes simply refer to an official, but more than likely in this case, it's talking about an official that serves him who is capable of going into his harem, which would be a castrated male. And she is to be brought to him wearing her royal crown. Why doesn't it say royal robes and crown? Have you thought about it? Remember, he wants to show off her beauty. He wants to show the people just how beautiful this woman is. And you tell her to come in the royal crown. Now remember, there was nothing that forbade a woman from being in one of these feasts as long as she was invited. As long as the king or the one holding the feast invited her to come in, she could come. Remember that Ahasuerus had been showing off his great wealth and all of his possessions. What was a possession of his? Now we'll talk about this more later, but his queen was his possession. Last of all, he intends at this feast to show off his beautiful wife. And so he invited her to come and appear before him. So the question is, how was she to be brought to this feast? Some believe that it was to show off the royal apparel that she would be wearing. Willis is one of those, but I want to point something out. Willis is a man who has lived in the last 100 years. Some believe that it meant to come without her veil on. In the Persian society, for a woman to appear without her veil, and remember what a veil was. A veil wasn't a little bitty piece of cloth somebody puts on the top of their heads, as some of our brethren advocated over the years. No, that's not a veil. A veil would cover her all the way from the top of her head down below her neck so that only her eyes could be seen. For a woman in that society to appear in public, it was wrong for her to appear without her veil. Kaufman talks about that, but let's remember something there. Kaufman also was somebody who lived in the last 100 years. It has amazed me sometimes how we get to thinking about evidence and we'll say, oh, well, this writer says that way back 2,000 years ago, this is what it does. Well, there may be evidence for such, but at the same time, there may not be any evidence for what they say. And I'm suggesting that the evidence here is going to show us something else based on people who lived way back then, based on the Jewish Talmud, and based on the Targum. What was the Targum? What was the Talmud? These were both Jewish documents that told certain laws for the Jews, told about traditions of the Jews, some of them biblical, some of those traditions not biblical. But notice something. Vashti refuses. Some said that she refused because she was supposed to come in and show off her royal robes. Wrong for a woman to show off in public. And some thought that it meant without her veil, so that they could see her whole face. But others believed that it meant that she was to come before him only wearing her crown, her royal crown. Josephus, Jewish historian, he says that's the way it was. The Jewish Talmud and the Jewish Targum all say this is the way it was. My question would be, who should I put the most trust in? The historians of those times that didn't live long after these times, who maybe had more information than we do, or more modern? Vashti refused. Did she refuse to come before the king because of modesty? Maybe. You know, that's what we've been teaching our children in Bible classes, hadn't it? For forever. I heard it when I was a kid. I've heard other teachers teach that. We don't know exactly what it was, but I will mention this. If she had come only without her veil, with all the rest of her clothes on, then that would have been a mark of modesty. She would have been violating modesty. So whatever it was, we don't know exactly. We can't be absolutely sure. All we can do is try to rely upon the ancients and what they said. And notice what her refusal caused to happen. The king became what? Very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Wroth. Katsar. To crack off. To burst out in rage. Now, we've already shown an example of how this king could be extremely cruel and mean and just quickly do something that maybe later he'd regret. Brown, Driver, and Brown says that this word means to put oneself in a rage. To burst into a rage, just become so angry, so quick. Have you ever seen somebody like that? We probably all have, haven't we? But notice the other idea, anger. Well, isn't wrath and anger the same? They have a little bit different meanings to them. The word anger means in heat, rage, hot displeasure. And that fits in with the idea of bursting in rage, but it adds to it. He's just so angry that he just cannot control himself. He's so angry that common sense is out the door. He's not going to stop and consider the effects of this rage. And the word burn means to kindle, to consume. It has consumed him. Vashti's refusal causes Xerxes Xerxes to burst out in rage, in a hot rage that is consuming him, that cannot be controlled. He's so angry he can't think straight. And add to that his intoxication. He's been drinking with these people for 180 days, and now a drinking festival for 7 days. His anger is unreasonable. Butler made an interesting statement. He said that he was reportedly very rich and indulgent, talking about Ahasuerus as a person. He was reportedly very rich, we know that, and indulgent, and habitually acted like an impudent, petulant brat. You ever seen any of those? You ever watched in a grocery store? I like to watch people. Sometimes it upsets me. But have you ever seen a kid in a grocery store that his mother says, no, you can't, no, we're not going to buy that candy that you want, or whatever it is, and the kid gets angry and yells at her? You ever seen something like that? We all have. Well, that's the way Ahasuerus was. That's the demonstration, and part of the reason why I told you about him having this man cut in half. He acted like a spoiled brat. Listen to another one. Herodias, the Greek historian, tells us that he beheaded the men who had built the famous bridge of boats across the Hellespont because a storm had destroyed the bridge. And he commanded the sea to be scourged. Think about that. To be scourged and then chained by sinking fetters in it. What kind of a man is that? It's a crazy man, isn't it? This is a man who's so spoiled that he thinks just because he says something or wants something to be done, it can be done, and there's nothing that can stop him. And so he had these men who built a boat bridge, which was an amazing accomplishment in that time, across the Hellespont, this big body of water. And then a storm came along and destroyed the bridge so that he couldn't cross it with his armies. And so he had the men who had built the bridge had their heads cut off. Is that a spoiled person? And then he had somebody go and take whips and beat the water as if he was hurting the water. And then, I'm going to chain this water. I'll keep it from doing that again. And had fetters thrown into it. Fetters, chains with the thing on the end that you fasten around the limbs of someone to chain them up. One of the interesting things that I see in this text, and it's always puzzled me, and it still puzzles me, Vashti is never condemned, nor is she praised for what she does in this text. That's always puzzled me. I don't understand it. If she did this because of modesty, refused this because of modesty, shouldn't she be praised? If she did it because she just didn't want to obey the king's order, shouldn't she be condemned? And that's always puzzled me. But notice that all of these events are just simply stated. We're just given the history. We're not given a lot of the reasons behind some of the things that are said. And isn't that very much like what God does a lot of times? Hasn't God told us in the Christian age, hasn't He given us the law of Christ? And do we always fully understand why He's told us certain things? to do or not to do? You know, to a new Christian, he may understand the words that God said, don't do this or don't do that, but he may not have enough background to fully understand why he's told to do or not to do something. We'll come back to verse 13, or start with verse 13 next week, where this old king is going to do something right. He's going to ask for some advice.